Alpine Liquid Fertilizers is your full season crop fertility specialist from start to finish. Visit alpinepfl.com for more.
You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
This is Ruminating with RealAg, and I am your host, Amber Bell. For today's episode, we're going to be speaking with Dallas Mount of Ranching for Profit. Dallas has a lot of experience when it comes to helping farmers and ranchers improve the profitability on their farms. And so for today's episode, we're going to be talking about succession planning. We're going to go into how to determine whether or not you're making a profit and maybe where some of that money might be going if you are not or just simply aren't sure. And then we're also going to be talking about decision-making process when markets are really high like they are right now when it comes to cattle. So settle in, get comfortable, and get ready for the conversation. Hi, Dallas. Welcome to Ruminating with RealAg. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me on.
It's been quite a bit. And so you were telling me a little bit earlier that business is doing really well. You've been keeping busy.
We have been, yeah. We're in the middle of our busy season, which is our December through January. We'll probably do, I think, 7 schools this year, which is about half of the schools we do over the course of a 12-month period. So yeah, this is our busy season. We got a couple more schools in front of us, and yeah, we're having fun, meeting a lot of great people.
So before we actually get rolling on some of the details on best management practices for financial decision making, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit just about your business, how it came into play? Give us a little bit of background.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm with Ranch Management Consultants. We put on what folks will recognize as the Ranching for Profit School. Our company has been around about 40 years, so it's kind of neat to celebrate that anniversary this year. I'm the third owner of the company. We were founded by Stan Parsons. Dave Pratt ran the company for about 20 years, and I've been running the company about 5, but involved with the business about 10 years. So it's a lot of fun. So our main thing is we help farmers and ranchers on business management. So we help them understand how to look inside their business, how to identify things that they're doing well, how to identify weak points in their business, and then what they can do about it.
Right. And I think that's kind of a little bit of a testimony on its own, right? Because you can't talk about finances on a farm without talking about succession. And so it's kind of cool to hear what the succession of your guys' own business has been. Do you have any learning moments that you've had from that?
A bunch, yeah. First of all, I was really blessed that Dave Pratt prepared the company the way he did. It was very well set up when we did the transition. You couldn't have found a more gracious, understanding successor than what he did. One of the things I think worked really well in our situation and is we tore off the Band-Aid. On one day, all the income that was coming in was his, and every bill that was coming in was his. And on the next day, every bill that came in was mine, and every bit of income that came in was mine. So it was it was a very abrupt succession. And I could always reach out and call him, and of course, pick his brain about it. But it was my decisions to make, and I'm the one that got to live with the successes or failures of those decisions. And I think that was a good thing. Of course, there were some bumpy things along the way, but yeah, that was a nice way to do it. I've only seen one other farm or ranch that I know of that intentionally did their succession that way. More of them, it's generally more of a process. But I think one of the lessons from that is it's not something that needs to be drug out over an extremely long, excruciating period, which is what a lot of times we do in farming and ranching is, right? While one person is declining, unfortunately, sometimes it's decades of transition of leadership.
Right, and that would be really tough too. I like that idea of kind of going in. Do you feel though that it might be too much of a sink or swim model for a young farmer coming up?
That would be a tough model for somebody who's really just getting their feet under them to do the tear off the Band-Aid method. But I also think, maybe over a period of 3 to 5 years, right? It doesn't need to be 20 years, right? Of a succession. But yeah, that was some of the lessons from us. But yeah, it was a lot of other things along the way. It's funny, we teach this stuff, so it was fun going through it ourselves.
Well, it gives you that relatability, right? You can be like, well, we did this. This worked. This doesn't.
Yeah, yep,
That's
for
super cool.
sure.
And what would be some of the don't do's that you maybe learned, or something that you would recommend someone do a little bit differently if it comes down to farm succession?
Oh boy, on farm succession, a whole bunch of stuff. Looking back on our particular thing, I think it worked fairly well. I'm not sure as I look back on that there was anything I think we really messed up on. But on farm succession, boy, where do I start? There's a whole lot of don't do's. Probably the biggest thing we see is people wait too long to put it into place. I recently just read a book on business succession, and the guy said your professional demise is coming sooner than you expect, right? And he actually went through a whole bunch of data about CEOs and leadership of business and looking at their decades of their life, and he pointed out that when you leave your 40s, your ability to innovate plummets. Right
Right.
now, your ability to do other things in the business, complicated decision making, things like that. But oftentimes, the person who is sitting in the seat of the decision maker, if they're in their 60s, they're much more in a protectionist mindset than a growth mindset, which is where they should be, right? So,
Right. Right.
yeah, so I think that's one thing is we wait too long to do it. I think another major mistake is it. Oftentimes, we don't give clarity to the incoming generation about what the plan is.
Hmm.
And mom and dad, they want to do what's fair. They want to do what they think is right. They don't want to cause turmoil among the siblings. So oftentimes, the easy choice is to do nothing, right, and to just sit there and let it stew and ignore it. But it really screws up. And we all know families that have been torn apart by a succession plan that was some kind of great big reveal, and people were surprised by what they saw, and so I think maybe those two tips would be, do it sooner than you expect and make it clear to people who are making the choice of returning to the farm to build their life on that. Because, if you're making those decisions of, hey, we're going to build our life on this farm, you kind of need to know what the deal is on the front
You
end,
do.
right?
And those are really good suggestions. And on top of it, do you have a feel for how many people are of the older generation that are going to be passing down the farm are actually showing the younger generation the books, and they actually have a good idea of what the income coming into the farm versus what's being paid out?
I think my sample size would be extremely biased because we tend to work with the more progressive folks, right? Anybody that's going to come to a school like we teach for 5 or 7 days generally are going to be the more progressive people. So of the people that we get to work with, I'd say probably 80 to 90% of them are inside the books of the operation and working in it. I think if we looked at agriculture as a whole, that number would be much smaller.
Right. I could see that for sure. And then, so speaking about that, there is a lot of confusion, I think, sometimes around what is a profit. So can we go into that a little bit? Because that's sort of your guys' specialty. Because I know a lot of people think they're making a profit, and when they actually break down the numbers, are a little bit disappointed by what they end up finding. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's actually a lot in there to unpack. So, if we ask, so let's say we stopped 100 farmers and ranchers on the street, and we said, "Are you making a profit?" They'd probably say, "Well, some years we are, some years we aren't." Okay, define a profit for me. If I asked them to do that, most of them would probably define it as the money left over after we pay all this year's bills,
Right.
right? And
Right.
and so they're looking at cash flow perspective. Were they able to cash flow operations, right?
Hmm.
When we look at money, we break money issues down into primarily two buckets, and then there's a third. The first bucket is economics. Okay, so when we look at things from an economic perspective, and this is how we'll define profit, is an economic profit, is could we start this business from scratch tomorrow? Okay, so can we rent the land at going rates? Can we pay the full cost of labor so we don't get to subsidize it with unpaid labor? Or most farmers and ranchers are probably not paying themselves very much, or if they are, or some of them aren't even paying themselves at all, but others are probably paying themselves a fraction of what it would actually cost to replace the work they're doing, right? So can we rent the land? Can pay the full cost of labor? Can we pay the interest on the assets involved in the production company, and all other production costs? Okay, so if we could do those and still have money left over, then that's profit, right? And profit can be used in a variety of ways. We could use it to pay down debt. We could use it to go back into the business for infrastructure upgrades, improvements. We could use it for off-farm investing. We could build cash reserves, right? So there's all sorts of things you can do with profit. But truly defined economic profit is, could I start this business tomorrow, borrow the money to run the operating company and rent the land and pay myself what it would cost to replace me and still have money left over?
Right. And
That's a true economic profit.
that's a really hard question for a lot of people, right? Because a lot of farms are built on land that has been owned for a number of generations that there's no longer payments on. So that's a really, really hard question. What would be the importance in asking that versus just the year to year? What difference would that make on a farm?
So it helps us identify what's working in the business and what's not. So if I've got a livestock company that is operating on my owned land, and I'm doing it with inherited wealth, right? With family money. Okay. And I look at my cash flow at the end of the year and I say, oh, I've got $100,000 more than what I started the year with. Okay. Now I don't know if all I'm doing is doing my tax accounting, let's say, right? Just turning in those books. And I don't know if it was my livestock that made money, if it was my land business that made money, if it was my money that made money, right? I can't separate those things out. What we're going to do is start separating those things out economically. Now, whether you actually separate those things out financially, whether you actually write a check for the land, that's a totally different subject. But we're gonna put them in the right bucket so I can say, this is the money my cattle made, this is the money my cropping made, this is the money my land investment made, right? So we can start putting those things in their right buckets.
Right, so that really just gives people a decision-making tool. So if you need to invest here, well, now you know that it's worth investing in. Or do we need to change this in order to make those investments make a profit?
Correct. So what if the neighbor's place came up for lease tomorrow? Yeah. Could you go out and lease it for fair market value? Could you go out and buy the cattle and pay interest on the cattle to stock it? Right. So if you don't have those things figured out the right way, then you're just guessing. If you haven't figured out the right way, then we absolutely know, yes, this is what my business takes to run my business.
That's really good. And I don't think we can talk about cattle right now without talking about cattle prices because they're crazy. Like highest
Yeah.
we've seen
Yeah.
when it comes to live cattle prices right now. So when it comes to that, how does that maybe change some of the decision making? Like how much should we be looking at, you know, is it worth holding back our heifers? Or are we better off selling them at this point? What would that decision making process look like?
Yeah. Yeah, what an amazing time. I mean, I've been doing this for golly, going on almost 30 years now as I think about it. And this is, the highest numbers that we've ever seen. Um, you know, it the fundamentals are the same, right? We're still going to look at the numbers the same. The opportunities have never been greater. It brings with it some challenges. And, anybody that's been in this game for very long realizes the cure for high prices is high prices, right? So they will come tumbling down at some point, whether it's next week or next year or 2 years from now, right? This thing, the wind is going to come out of this thing in a big hurry when it comes out. Um, it changes quite a few things. For the replacement cost. We had a class last week, and we were calculating up the replacement cost for females in the herd. We're seeing some numbers higher than we've ever seen, in terms of, okay, we've got a lot of capital. So if you had a cow, $1 million in capital a couple years ago. Now it's probably worth $2 million, right? So there's a lot of capital at play that's sitting out there. If you don't sell it, then who really cares what it's worth, right?
Right.
It's like saying, well, your house just went up in value 100%, right? Well, you need a place to live, right? So if you sell your house, you've got to go buy another house that's just as expensive. So if you sell your cow herd, you've got to go buy another cow herd if you want to stay in the cattle ownership business. So I mean, some of it is just kind of like, well, it is what it is. We're going to plow on. But then there's some opportunities too. If you're thinking about doing something other than cows, I mean, you'd probably be smart to get out now, right? Because why sit around and wait for it to come down to get out? If you're thinking about growing something, it's probably a pretty challenging decision to really make a case that I'm going to go out and buy a cow that I plan to keep for several years. Right. I mean, I'd have a hard time seeing how somebody could make that argument of, hey, now's the time to go out and buy a bunch of bred cows and I'm going to sell them 3 years from now because you're probably going to be selling them for, I mean, on a market that's much slower than the market today. If you're buying something that's going to turn fairly quickly, then the price itself really doesn't matter all that much, right? It's much more the relationship of the price. What am I buying? What am I selling? And we're looking at those relationships. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on. But your question around heifers, so we're seeing a lot of folks that, let's say I'm keeping a $1,500 to $1,700 heifer. Most of the ranches I see it's going to take $1,000 to get her to make her become a bred heifer, right? By the time we figure in the value of the grass, the value of the money invested in her, some feed, some health, some breeding cost, right? I'd be pretty surprised if you could do it for much less than $1,000. So we're going to have a $2,700 bred heifer, right, by the time she comes around a year from now, if not more. I mean, there's people who their costs are going to be substantially higher, a few people whose costs are going to be lower. So yeah, it's an interesting consideration. I think the really interesting one is those middle-aged cows, right? So if we play this out, if let's say I've got a herd and it's made up of all the different age classes, if I've got a set of cows that are worth $3,000 today, and I'm planning on keeping her to turning her into a 9-year-old cow, right? I'm going to keep her another 3 years. Then my $3,000 cow 3 years from now is probably going to be worth $900, right?
Yeah, right, right.
That's a lot of money coming out of her. That is a huge shift. So I think those are some interesting questions at play. I don't have all the answers for it. Everybody's cost structure is different. So what works for one ranch is not going to be the same thing that works for another.
So do you think then, like, my automatic reaction is kind of like, well, this would be the time that I'd be wanting to call really hard and get rid of anything that I'm like, yeah, kind of shaky on, don't want these traits, don't want that. That would be my initial reaction on it. I think that you bring up a really good point when it comes to what stage of life that cow's at, because it's possible, okay, you can sell that 6-year-old and 2 years down the road or sooner if the markets drop, right? You could replace her for really cheap. So, yeah, do you have any like sort of a 3 top steps to sort of what you would say to kind of look at to make those decisions?
So if you were thinking about doing that, I would want to see what's the gross margin on the cow herd that you're thinking about shrinking. If you have and when I say gross margin, what I mean by that is what's the value that herd produces minus the direct cost to run it, right? So how much is left to service the overheads of your business? And what that number tells us is it tells us the economic efficiency of that cow herd, right? If you're sitting on a cow herd that is really working well, then it's going to be much harder to make an argument that we need to shrink that herd down, right? If you're sitting on a cow herd that has a unimpressive gross margin, right? They're doing okay, but they're not really doing that well. And we could replace what the place those animals are taking on your farm with something else that had a much stronger gross margin. Then I'd be all for it, right? I'd be like, absolutely, let's cash them in now while the market's high, and let's bring in whatever we're going to replace them with. Right.
Hmm.
So for some of our folks, like let's say you're in central Nebraska. Central Nebraska has an extremely high market for custom grazing cattle. Right. So if you're right, let's say you can make $500 for grazing a cow for 5 months in central Nebraska. Right. And let's say your owned cow makes $400 after 12 months of sitting on your place. Right. Well, that's a no-brainer. Right. Peddle those owned cows and replace them with somebody else's cow for half the year that makes more money. If your cow's making $1,000 and you're going to get rid of her and replace her with a cow that's making $500, right? Then we're going to scrutinize that a bit more. So it's a long way of saying it depends.
Right, right. And that I feel like too often that's the answer when we're all looking for a prescription.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
going to the opposite side of that, where would you advise people when it comes to flipping cattle? So, hey, markets are really strong. Would this be a good time to be like, hey, I'm going to buy and, end of the season, just sell it off?
Yeah. Um, so we work with a lot of clients who also go to sell by marketing schools. There's several people around that are teaching these sell by marketing schools around the cattle business, and a lot of people look at what they're teaching there and they say they're telling me to flip cattle. Right. That might not be what they're saying, but that's what a lot of people hear is, hey, look at the opportunity to sell this and buy this and sell this and buy this. Some of those folks that are putting into practice the things they learn at the sell by marketing schools are some of our most profitable clients. So there is really something to it, to the people that know how to apply those principles and know how to put them into place for their business. That being said, for another handful of the folks, when they learn those things, it's obvious that's kind of not their thing, right? Maybe they don't live in a place where they're really close to markets that they can do that with. Maybe their cost of transportation is really high. Maybe they're just not very good at it, right? So there's a handful of people that you just kind of need to look inside yourself and say, you know what, this is probably not something I need to be doing is trading that. However, that being said, I think cow calf producers, especially, we tend to get very emotionally attached to our breeding stock, and that really screws up our decision making. So having a mindset of a cattle trader, even if it's a breeding herd, is a really good mindset to have. And you know what I would mean by that is kind of the mindset of everything that's on my place is for sale every day of the week if somebody comes around and offers me the right price for it, right? And so we were throwing out a number of $3,000 bred cows. So if you're sitting on a cow herd and bred cows are selling for $3,000, all your cattle are worth right, $3,000. If you don't sell them, it's the same decision as you just bought them, right?
Right.
I mean, if everybody in some way is a cattle trader, it's just how do you think about your inventory, right?
Hmm.
So some of you guys that are sitting there thinking, I don't trade cattle. Well, you do. You make decisions every day about, am I going to sell this group? Am I going to sell this group? Am I going to sell that group? And that's essentially the same decisions a cattle trader makes is, which classes am I going to keep and which classes am I going to sell?
Right. So you speak a little bit about sort of the profit center idea on, okay, well, this part of the farm is making money, this part's not. And once you have an idea of those numbers, would there be a place, or have you seen a lot of people that go into, okay, maybe that's not their entire operation is flipping cattle, but perhaps, hey, markets are high, this might be a time to do it, and then, get rid of them, and then that's the end of that. Is there a place for that, or are you seeing people doing stuff of that nature?
Yeah, we certainly are. There's in all the different segments from people that have a portion of their herd that's always in change to there's a few really I mean, just brilliant ranches down here that I know of that kind of have the long-term strategy of we grow the cow herd when the market is low, and then when we get into these periods of time, we start liquidating that cow herd, and then maybe they go to stockers for the next few years, and then when the market's at a bottom, they're gonna start retaining heifers or buying heifers and kind of doing it all again. So there's kind of the short program and the long program. A couple comments on that. So yes, when we are really strong that everybody needs to break down their business into the various enterprises, and you have to know your gross margin by enterprise. There's no other way to look at these businesses, and unfortunately, most farms and ranches don't do that. Right? Everything's just thrown together in a big wad, and we try to make decisions at the end of the year based on that big wad, and it's a terrible way to run your business. And it's all you also another thing that we see people doing is trying to allocate everything on their farm or ranch to the cost of a bushel of corn or the cost of a calf, right? Your numbers don't work that way. That's not a very useful thing to do. People say, well, it costs me $1,200 to produce a calf if I charge this much of my pickup to that calf and this much of my tractor to that calf and this much of that. Well, it doesn't work that way, right? You go add another 50 cows, are you going to go buy another tractor? Probably not,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
Having one tractor serve it. So you got to look at these things in the right way. So when we get them lined out and we put them in a profit or loss statement that has the enterprises at the top, and those enterprises are producing a gross margin, which services the overheads of the business. So we show the overheads down here. When we do that, we see that our most profitable businesses generally do two or three things really well and at scale, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we've got this enterprise, and this enterprise, right? So maybe we're doing two or three things that are working that we're really good at doing. We're doing those at scale. You hear a lot of recommendations, especially in kind of some of the small farms places and the regen stuff, that everybody should be diversifying, right? And I think that can really be a terrible recommendation because
Really?
we see people that start chasing lots of little things. Okay. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're super busy and you're not doing anything well. And from an economic standpoint, we can't tell what the heck's going on in your business because you have 15 little things going on, right? And it's so hard to separate this from this from this, right? That it's kind of a disaster. So um, I just caution folks if you're going to do an enterprise, let's make sure we're doing an enterprise that actually moves the needle on the place, right? So if I'm running a $1 million gross revenue business and I go add 10 pigs, right? If the 10 pigs
Not
all
really going
died
to make a
tomorrow,
ton
who
of
cares,
money.
right?
Yeah.
It's not going to make a difference to my business, right?
Yeah.
Now, if I'm running a $1 million business and I go at an enterprise that produces $300,000 in gross revenue, okay, right now we've got something to talk about. And I'm all for trying something, right? But at the end of the day, if we're going to continue to do this thing, it's actually got to operate at the scale that it actually makes a difference.
Right. And I think that brings up a really good point about the fact, like, it's one thing to say, hey, we all need to diversify. It's another to say, I don't know what's happening with my business at this moment. And now I'm also going to diversify because that's just adding another layer of not knowing what's happening.
Yes, yes, absolutely, yeah, and yeah, and this idea of direct marketing too, and that everybody should be a direct marketer. That just scares the heck out of me because a lot of our good farmers are good at producing, and they're terrible marketers, right? And now we're trying to tell people, hey, you've been out in the pasture being a producer all your life. Go sit at the booth at the farmers market and sell this stuff, right? That's not how many of us were equipped, right? Is we're
Right.
good at production, we're terrible at marketing. So, either hire somebody that's going to do that for your business that's really good at it, or don't go down that path.
Well,
Right?
I think that's something that a lot of producers are kind of surprised by because so I did a fair bit of direct marketing, and I think a lot of producers think, oh, yeah, well, I can just show up on Saturdays at the farmers market and it's going to be fine. And to actually do a good job of direct marketing, even on a small business, very small business, it's still a full-time job, just the marketing part on its own,
Yes.
right? And I think that that gets
Yes.
lost on a lot. Like we're not in the time 50 years ago, where going to the farmers market booth, it was all really local. Like there's so much competition out there right now that it's a tough go. It's not easy.
Yeah. Yeah. It sure is. So yeah, I some of those kind of swings of the pendulum and trends, that's one of the ones that scares me a little bit.
Okay, so here's another question for you. Because there's so many different things going on when it comes to finances on the farm. How do you think ranchers should be prioritizing spending when it comes to like operational costs, capital investments, debt repayment? Like, where do you see those repayment plans and, that budgeting lining up?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, there's a lot in there to unpack. Um, let me back up from that just a little bit if I could.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing any competent business leader is going to be able to produce is a useful profit and loss statement and a useful balance sheet. Okay.
Hmm.
So if I'm going to sit down with somebody and look at their business, I need to be able to see this and read it and interpret it with about 2 minutes of effort. Right. So I want to look at one page profit and loss that has your enterprises, overheads, right, broken down. And then laying right next to that, I want to see your balance sheet and things like, your current assets, your intermediate assets, your long-term assets, the liabilities that go with each of those. So if those are well prepared, we can sit down and say with certainty, business, here's the pieces of it that are working, here's the way it's servicing the overheads, and then here's the way the debt is structured in this business, here's the way money's coming in, right? Either one of those two things alone don't give you the whole picture, right? I could show you a really good looking profit or loss statement that would say I'm making all kinds of money, but without seeing the balance sheet, you might be going broke because you're not able to service your debt, right? You might have gone out yesterday and bought a whole bunch of land and a whole bunch of cattle. And yes, your business is profitable, but it's not profitable enough to cover your debt
To cover
obligations.
debt loads. Yeah.
Right. And just the opposite, we could look at a business that's losing $100,000 a year, but they don't owe anybody anything and it's all inherited stuff, right? So they might be very comfortably financially, right? They might be, just fine. And if they're happy, who cares? So what first thing we're going to want to do is sit down and be able to get the pulse on this business, right? Is this in terms of the operating company, is it working? And then in terms on how the debt is structured and things like that, are we in a healthy position? So once we have those, then we can start answering those questions of deployment of capital, right? Use of profit. If I've got a business that's really profitable and there's a track record of profitability, then I'm all about growing that thing, right? Let's do more of it, right? Let's throw some more, assuming they want to grow it, right? Assuming maybe there's kids coming back, maybe there's people they want to add to the business. Let's grow that thing. Where I really struggle is when you look at a business that's economically losing money, and in years like this, when we have a little bit of free cash flow, we throw that money into things that actually make the problem worse.
Right.
Right. And that happens all the time, especially right now. You're going to see a lot of businesses that are going to have a pretty good amount of cash left over at the end of the year. And what are they going to do with it? They're probably going to add overheads with things that actually don't make their business any more money.
Mm.
It might shelter some money from tax, but that doesn't make you more profitable, right?
What would some of
So
those things
so
be?
that's machinery for sure. Yeah, that'd be the number one thing is,
Go buy a
a bunch
tractor.
of a bunch of stuff that make our life more comfortable and it's cool and they're fun to drive, right? But at the end of the day, they often don't make your business more profitable. Now, of course, there are exceptions, right? If you run an excavating company, a track hoe probably makes a lot of sense, right?
Right.
But if you're in the ranching business, you probably don't need two, right?
They might look pretty though.
They might look pretty, and you can use one to pull the other one out. So that
Exactly.
sometimes happens.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes sense. And where would you say that debt repayment thing? Because that's been coming a lot, right? So a year like this year where maybe you've made a huge profit on your cattle, is that a good time to be paying off that debt? What would you be looking at for that?
Probably not. Most of the businesses that we see, their debt was structured several years ago. So a lot of them are carrying fairly low interest debt. Now, if you structured a bunch of debt that is at 8% interest, right, and things like that, I could probably get a little bit more interested in servicing it. The other thing we're going to look at is the amount of working capital. So working capital is let me just give you the layman's term. If I sold off everything I have planned to sell in the next few months, and I paid off everybody that I owe in this coming year, how much money would I have left? Right. So that's an important number to know. That's called your working capital. It essentially means how much money do you have to get yourself out of a jam or out of a low season? Okay. A lot of our farms and ranches are very wealthy on the balance sheet at the bottom line, right? Their net worth is very high, but the actual money that they can get their hands on is extremely low. Okay.
Right.
So most of the stuff is not for sale, right? Most cows, most of our machinery, most of all that kind of stuff. These are all
Yeah.
fixed assets
Hmm.
Land, yeah, and we're trying to service all these fixed assets with this teeny tiny amount of income, right, from our year. So in that case, if your working capital is low, accelerating your debt repayment makes it worse,
Huh.
right? So if I take some of this year's cash and I throw it at the debt, right? Yeah, my debt obligation goes down, but there goes all my working capital.
Right.
Right. So now I have less money that I can get my hands on with, of course, without going and making a new loan. Right. I could probably go back to the bank and say, well, oops, I made a mistake. I want to take out another loan on that land that I paid off. Right. But now you're probably going to be at new financing terms.
Higher interest rates and everything. So where would you recommend? And I know it's really hard because it's a very broad generalization, but say at the end of the year or even at the end of next year, if cattle markets continue the way they're going, where would you recommend people put that extra income that may have come in order to sort of promote what you're doing on the farm?
Great question. So if we have profitable enterprises on the farm that have the opportunity to expand, that's a great place to do that. Maybe we want to take it off farm. Maybe we want to look at putting it in a place that's going to be good at producing cash flow in years when the farm is having tough times. So, commercial real estate investments, other businesses that don't require a lot of input of time, labor. We've had alumni do storage units, car washes, right? Things like this that are other businesses that I could start and park that money in there that are going to produce cash flow. So when the next drought happens and I've got to go for a period without any income, I can go lean on this other thing I've created that's kicking off money.
Right, that's really good. And okay, so let's go to kind of to the other side because we talked about what to do with profitability. Now, if a rancher is looking at their profit loss statements and everything and want to get a good idea of where some of those hidden unnecessary costs are, I think all of us can kind of go to our bank account and be like, what the heck, where did my money go this month? Right? What would be some tips for them to kind of figure out where some of the money's going when they get to there and they're like, hey,
Yeah.
like I spent more than I thought. Where did this money go?
Yeah, yeah. So we like to think about the expenditures and income, both all these things as buckets, right? So let's build some like 5 gallon buckets that are sitting below me here, and I'm going to throw my different costs into some of these buckets. So for every enterprise, you need one bucket that is the direct cost for that enterprise. So, and like for cows, that would be feed, um, vet medicine charges, AI charges, things like that. For cropping, it's going to be all your inputs for that particular crop, right? Seed, fertilizer, chem, all those things. So for every one of your enterprises, you need a separate bucket that's the direct cost for those buckets, and we use that to calculate the gross margin of the enterprise. The other buckets are going to be our overhead buckets, and we're going to have, if we've got different divisions on the farm. So let's say I'm doing livestock and I'm also doing farming. I'm going to have a livestock division and a farming division. So any overheads that exist solely for that division go into that bucket. Okay. And so like farming overheads are going to be things like, your baler, your combine, right? Your implements, those kind of things, the things that would not make sense to have on hand if all I did was run livestock.
Right.
Right. And things in the livestock division overheads are going to be labor units that are just for livestock, portable corrals, maybe some four-wheelers and stock trailers, right? Things like that that only exist for running livestock. And then the biggest bucket for most farms is the business overheads. So these are just the cost of keeping the lights on the farm or ranch. So it's my salary as an owner, housing, buildings, the base level of machinery, any shared equipment, that four-wheel drive tractor that pulls the baler and the cow feeder, right? That's a business overhead. So any of those things. So once we have our costs in these correct buckets, then we can start looking at, okay, what's the total gross revenue on the farm and what percent of that gross revenue is eaten up by each of these buckets, right? And we have some what we call our benchmark numbers. that we prescribe for those. So when farms get their numbers laid out the way that we teach, we start looking at those things. And if things are way out of whack, it's going to throw a big red light on that part of your business and say, whoa, 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 relative to the size of my business, this thing's way too big. And one of the real common ones to have be way out of whack is that business overheads, right? If I've got two families that I'm trying to support, right? Maybe a couple full-time salaries, a couple of households, all the utilities, right? All those things on, let's say 125 mama cows, right? Then that's going to be way out of whack,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really good. And I think that it kind of speaks back to that diversification piece because if you don't have an idea of which bucket each is going into, you're going to end up like diversifying makes that so much worse because it's just more all
Yes.
in one, right? Yeah, I really like that. That makes sense. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
let's
Yep.
also talk about insurance. Okay, and where does it make sense for insurance on the ranch? Where doesn't it maybe? And does that get looked at in the same way that you would look at the other kind of the different buckets?
Yeah. You're talking when you say insurance, you're talking about like basic ranch coverage, like risk insurance, liability insurance, or are you talking about price protection insurance?
Both. Because I
Okay.
know they'd probably have to be
Okay.
treated a little bit differently, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So price protection insurance, let's just talk about that real quick. And along with that would go all your futures and trading and things like that, right? Whether it's contracts or put options, price insurance is just another tool in that toolbox to manage that risk. The thought of that is if now it complicates it a little bit with the government subsidies for it and all that stuff. Let's just take all that stuff off the table because and just treat it like it was all dollar for dollar. Um, what we tend to find is those businesses who should actually be using these insurance tools are not the ones that do it. It's almost like it's flip-flopped. So if you could sustain a really rough year in terms of a market swing. So like let's say right now, here where calves are starting to be born, you could go out there and buy an insurance for your $3.25 calves this fall, right? You can go out and buy an insurance product that says, I'm going to guarantee my calves are worth X, right? So somebody might look at that and say, well, it's going to cost me $50 a head to do that, right? So I could guarantee a $1,700 calf for $50 today, right? So if I took that $50 off, essentially I could say, if I did this deal, I'm guaranteeing I got $1,650 for my calves this fall, right? 1,700 minus the 50. So a lot of people are going to look at that and say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let it ride, right? Some of the businesses could sustain that. So let's say calf prices move to $1,100 this fall, right? Which they very well could. Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, a lot of businesses are going to be, well, okay, that stinks. I would have rather sold them for $1,700. $1,100 is just fine. We can go down the road tomorrow with that, right? And other businesses, let's say you went out and bought a bunch of bred cows for $3,500 and you need that $1,700 to make your payment on those bred cows, right? That's the business that should be buying the insurance, right? So, but what we actually see is the people who are smaller, more startup, more financially strapped are the ones that are generally looked to cut every cost out of their business, insurance included, right? So,
Right.
so the way when you look at it from a logical standpoint, the people that are using it are generally the people that could withstand the bad year. The people that need to be buying it are people that generally don't have any insurance and are leaving it wide open, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't have a whole lot of comments on the ranch liability insurance piece. That's very much an individual financial thing. A lot of ranches that we know try to do that more through entity structure than through insurance, right? We're going to create a lot of separations where we put the land over here, the livestock over here, right? And try to do some risk protection through that entity structure. I sometimes think insurance actually might be a cheaper way to do that than by having a whole bunch of entities and having to pay tax returns on all those entities and then the complication that it creates in your business. So yeah, I don't have much feedback on that other than you better be paying attention to it and make some decisions around it.
Right. And I do think you have a point about the like insuring your calves and such, because the reality is when money's tight, it's really hard to be like, yeah, I'm going to throw it here and I might not see a return on that. Like so that's a really good point for it.
Yeah.
As we kind of wrap up here, what are some tips for producers that, just going into this next grazing season? What would be some of the tips that you would put forward for this time of year and being like, hey, okay, we want to get our acting gear. We want to make sure that we're making a profit. What would be there going forward?
So I think I'm going to go back to that profit and loss and balance sheet piece that I talked about earlier. I bet if you actually if we did a poll of agriculture as a whole, of people who make their living in ag, I bet less than 10% of people who are making their living in ag actually can show me a profit and loss and a balance sheet and be able to tell me what it means. If you're among the 90% that can't do that, I think you need to figure that out, right? That's essentially incompetent business leadership if you're not doing that, right? So
Right.
I would encourage everybody to let's get your butt in gear and help you figure out actually how to get your hands around what's going on inside your business. Tax accounting is about the worst thing to look at when you're trying to figure out if your business is working or not, right? Tax accounting has no relevance to if your business is actually successful or not. And that's unfortunately what a lot of people are trying to use to manage their business. So I would encourage you to, dive in, get some help, get some tools. Obviously, we'd like to be a part of that if we're a good fit, but there's other ways to do it. You're going to find a million and one ways to break the numbers down in a farm or a ranch. When all else fails, follow the KISS acronym, right? Keep it simple. And we tend to try to overcomplicate this stuff. You start looking at university systems where we're trying to break everything down to the nearest little nth degree and divide it all up. And at the end of the day, it's not very useful information. So how do we just create some big buckets and throw things in there? I wouldn't worry so much about accuracy. I mean, if you're running $1 million business and this number's off by $1,000, does it really matter? Right.
Yeah.
So as long as it's close enough to give you some good decision making points. And I've oftentimes in farm and ranching, we get so caught up with that the market moves and the weather moves, we feel very much like a victim of the circumstance. And it doesn't have to be that way. Let's manage the things that we can control. Knowing your numbers, being on top of your numbers is something you can control, right? We don't know where the market's going to move tomorrow. It might go up, it might go down. We don't know if it's going to rain tomorrow, but you do know what it costs you today. And we can get our hands on that. So I want to encourage people, it's wintertime here. We're talking the end of January. Great time to, sit in the house, drink coffee, figure out your numbers, and then stay on top of them.
Well, that's a great word of encouragement. I want to thank you so much, Dallas, for hanging out with me for a little while here. Where can people go to get a hold of you if they are looking for some more information?
Sure. Our website is ranchingforprofit.com. We encourage folks to sign up for our free newsletter there. Just throw your email in there. Twice a month, you'll get an email from us with one of our instructors sharing some thoughts with you. To a Ranching for Profit school, we'd love to have you come. So, yeah, that's where you find us.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. And that was Dallas Mount on Ruminating with Real Ag.